The sun had just begun to set over the peaceful farmlands of Earth, casting an orange glow across the rows of golden wheat and fields of corn that stretched as far as the eye could see. For Ben Carter, life was simple. A farmer by birth, he spent most of his days tending to the land his family had owned for generations. The smell of fresh soil and the hum of tractors were all he needed to feel connected to the world. To him, there was no greater joy than watching crops grow from the earth, nourished by the sweat of his brow. But on that day, everything changed. It began with the sky, an unusual streak of light. It wasn't a comet, nor was it an aircraft of human origin. It was too large, too bright, and far too ominous. As Ben wiped the sweat from his brow and looked up from his plow, his eyes narrowed. He had seen a lot in his life, but nothing like this. He wasn't the only one to notice. The neighboring farms stopped what they were doing. People looked up, their faces confused, some with fear beginning to show. It wasn't long before the first of the ships arrived, hundreds of them, massive vessels. Sleek and glimmering like metal predators, descended from the heavens. They had no markings, no flags, no identifiers. The size and scope of the fleet were overwhelming. They didn't land. They hovered just above the earth, casting long shadows over the land. The farmers stood frozen in place as the ships pulsed, with an eerie light, their engines humming with an unnatural intensity. At first, there was no sound, no bombs, no gunfire, just an unsettling silence as the massive ships hovered, casting a surreal calm over the fields. Then, without warning, the sky cracked open with a thunderous sound as the first strike came down, laser beams from the ship's weapons, cutting through the air and landing with terrifying accuracy on the fields below. Crops were instantly reduced to ash. The once vibrant wheat fields were obliterated in a flash of light. Ben's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't an attack on humanity. It was an attack on everything that made Earth home. Before anyone could react, the ground shook as more beams cut through the landscape. Crops burned in seconds. The rich, fertile earth that had sustained generations of families was being destroyed before their eyes. The alien ships hovered silently above, systematically destroying everything in their path. As if mocking the efforts of humanity, they made no effort to communicate, no demand for surrender. They were here for one thing: Earth's crops. Ben's mind raced. Why our crops? He muttered to himself, his hands gripping the handles of his plow in helpless frustration. It wasn't just the wheat fields or the corn. It was everything that humanity had worked for, the very foundation of their survival. And these invaders, whoever they were, seemed intent on taking it all. Panic started to ripple through the community. Farmers began to scatter, shouting for their families. Some running towards the nearest town for shelter. Others simply standing in disbelief, watching their livelihoods disintegrate before them. But Ben couldn't move. Something deep inside him told him that running wasn't the answer. He didn't know who these invaders were, or what they wanted, but he wasn't going to let them take everything without a fight. He turned to his son, Ethan, who had just come out of the barn, his face pale as he took in the sight of the ships above. Dad. What's going on? Ethan asked, his voice shaking. Ben's face hardened. We don't know yet, but we're going to find out. The alien ships had stopped firing for the moment. A deep silence settled over the land again. Ben knew that. This was the calm before the storm. The invaders had a purpose. They weren't here just to observe. They wanted something, and from what he could see, it was Earth's crops. But why? Was this part of a larger plan? What else could they possibly want with the land? He turned to Ethan, his voice grim. Get to the barn. Grab every weapon we have. Ethan's eyes widened. Weapons? We don't have any weapons, Dad. We're farmers. Ben was already moving toward the small shed next to the barn, where he knew they kept the old hunting rifles his father had used. We do now. As Ben and Ethan worked quickly to arm themselves, The sound of engines roaring to life broke through the quiet. The alien ships began to move again, not just above the fields but toward the nearby town. They weren't just targeting the crops anymore, they were targeting humanity itself. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. We need to stop them before they reach the town, he muttered, his voice steady. Even though his mind was racing, he could see it now. This wasn't just an attack on his farm. This was an invasion. Without thinking, he and Ethan grabbed the rifles, loaded them, and climbed into their old truck, ready to meet whatever threat lay ahead. They weren't soldiers. They weren't even trained fighters. But they had something that the aliens didn't understand: human resilience. They had Earth, they had their land, and they had each other. As they raced toward the town, Ben's thoughts kept returning to one thing. They came for our crops, but we weren't going to let them take everything. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, leaving only the eerie glow of alien ships casting long, unnatural shadows over the fields. Ben's truck rumbled down the dirt road toward the town, the engine's growl punctuating the heavy silence. Between him and Ethan, the only sound, aside from the truck's engine, was the distant hum of the hovering ships overhead. Their massive presence seemed to suffocate the landscape. Ethan's face was pale, his hands clenched around the rifle in his lap. He had never held a gun before that day. He wasn't a fighter. They weren't fighters. They were farmers. But now, as they raced through the empty streets toward the town, the reality of the situation began to settle in. No one knew what was coming. No one knew what to expect from the alien invaders. Ben's grip tightened on the wheel. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know how to stop them. But the feeling of helplessness was worse than the fear itself. His mind raced through every possible scenario, but there was no blueprint for this kind of fight. No training manual for how to deal with extraterrestrial invaders. The truck skidded to a halt as they reached the outskirts of town. The streets were eerily quiet. Too quiet. Ben's eyes scanned the sky. The alien ships had stopped hovering over the fields, but their presence still loomed. As he looked around, he could see the faint glow of fire in the distance, another farm burning, reduced to nothing by the laser strikes. We need to warn the others, Ben muttered under his breath. Gather as many people as we can. We need to form a resistance. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. He was just a kid, a farm boy who had grown up with his hands in the dirt, dreaming of a simple life. And now, here he was, facing something far beyond anything he could have imagined. But he wasn't backing down. Where do we start? Ethan asked. Ben didn't have an answer. But they had to start somewhere. They couldn't just let the invaders walk all over them. He had spent his life working the land, sowing seeds, and watching them grow. Now, it was time to sow something else. Rebellion. We start by finding the others, Ben said, his voice gaining strength. There are more farmers out here. We can organize. We can fight back. The truck bounced over the rough road, and soon they reached the town's main street. As they approached the first group of houses, Ben's eyes narrowed. He could see movement ahead, figures darting between buildings. People were already beginning to organize. Even if they didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, Ben slammed on the brakes and leaped out of the truck before it even fully stopped. Get inside, he shouted to the few neighbors he saw. We need to gather everyone we can. People were still in shock. Some were frozen in place, staring up at the alien ships in terror. Others were quickly collecting what they could: supplies, weapons, anything that might help them survive. But Ben could see it in their eyes. They were scared, unsure. They took our crops, Ben shouted, trying to rally them, but they haven't taken our spirit. We are farmers, and we know how to fight for what's ours. He looked at the group of men and women in front of him. They were just like him, people who had spent their lives working the land, never expecting they'd have to pick up arms. But now, They had no choice. The aliens hadn't just attacked their farms, they had attacked their way of life. Ethan joined him, holding up the rifle. "We're not alone. We're together in this," he said, his voice steady now, despite the fear that still lingered in his eyes. The farmers who had gathered began to nod, some murmuring agreements. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start the spark of rebellion. Ben scanned the group, his eyes landing on an older man who had seen more than his fair share of hard times. Jack Harris was a seasoned veteran of many battles, not of war, but of life. He had spent decades surviving through the toughest seasons, when the rains didn't come, when the markets collapsed, and when the world seemed to turn its back on the small farms like theirs. If anyone knew how to survive the impossible, it was Jack. "Jack," Ben called out, "we need your help. Do you know how to get into town's armory? We need weapons. We can't fight back with just pitchforks and rifles." Jack's face was grim, but he nodded. "The armory's down the street, near the old church. I know where they keep the supplies. But I'm telling you, Ben, we don't have much time. Those ships won't just sit there. They're going to come for us, and when they do, we need to be ready." Ben's pulse quickened. He knew Jack was right. The invaders wouldn't wait forever. They had come for their crops now. They would come for the people. The armory was their only chance. Without weapons, they were nothing. "We get to the armory," Ben said, looking around at the gathered farmers. "We get whatever we can, and we fight back. We're not letting them take everything." The group nodded, some still hesitating, but mostly determined. Ben could see the fire beginning to ignite in their eyes. They weren't just going to roll over. They were going to fight for their land, for their families, and for their future. Jack took the lead, Ben and Ethan following behind him. As they made their way down the street toward the armory, the sound of distant explosions rattled the windows of nearby homes. The invaders were already advancing. As they approached the armory, Ben could see smoke rising from the center of town. There were people running, but they weren't just fleeing, they were trying to resist. A few shots rang out from a distant street corner, followed by the thudding sound of alien weapons. They were already here. Ben's heart raced. The stakes had been raised. The farmers were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their future. And in that moment, Ben made a silent promise to himself. They would not go down without a fight. They would not let their crops, their land be taken without consequences. They were about to turn the tables. They would make the invaders regret ever setting foot on Earth. The air was thick with smoke as Ben, Ethan, and the group of farmers gathered outside the armory. The distant rumble of explosions echoed through the streets, a grim reminder of the alien invaders' relentless advance. The fires in the distance weren't just random destruction, they were signals, beacons of humanity's struggle to survive. Now casting their shadows over the town, the armory was a simple building, an old stone structure that had been used for centuries to protect the town from occasional marauders or the unpredictable storms that sometimes ravaged the area. But now, as Ben stood in front of the reinforced doors, the stakes were much higher. It wasn't just the crops they were protecting anymore, it was Earth itself. "Jack, you sure this is the way in?" Ben asked, his voice low, trying to keep his nerves in check. Jack Harris, a seasoned farmer who had lived through enough to know how to keep his cool, nodded. "I've been here 100 times. It's locked down tight, but I know how to get in." Ben's hand gripped the rifle at his side. It wasn't much an old hunting rifle, one that his father had used to protect the farm when Ben was a boy, but it was all he had. He glanced at Ethan, who stood next to him, eyes wide but determined. The kid had come a long way in a short time. They had to act fast. Every second they spent waiting could cost them their only chance to arm themselves properly. "Let's move," Ben said, taking a deep breath and nodding toward the door. "We don't have much time." They approached the armory cautiously, the sound of their boots on the cobblestones echoing ominously in the tense silence. The town was eerily still, like the calm before a storm. Through the haze of smoke, in the distance, the flickering lights of alien ships still hovered in the sky. "Hold tight," Jack whispered, as he crouched in front of the large, steel door. He worked quickly, his hands shaking slightly, but steady enough to pick the lock. The door clicked open with a quiet, satisfying sound, and the group slipped inside. The interior of the armory was stark stone walls, a few old wooden crates, and shelves lined with weapons that had been collected over the years. It was a far cry from the high-tech weapons the aliens would be wielding, but it was all they had. Ben's heart quickened. "Take what you can carry. We need rifles, explosives, anything that can help us fight." Without hesitation, the farmers moved quickly, rummaging through the crates and shelves. They picked up rifles, shotguns, and boxes of ammunition. They found a few old grenades, dusty, but still capable of doing damage. As Ben scanned the room, he saw the fear on the faces of the farmers, but there was something else. Determination. The fear was being replaced by a growing sense of purpose. They weren't just protecting their homes anymore, they were fighting back. Ben grabbed an old, heavy rifle from the shelf, testing its weight in his hands. "We're not just fighting for our crops," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're fighting for Earth, for our families, for everything we've built here, and we're not going to let these invaders take it from us." Ethan picked up a shotgun, his grip tight but uncertain. "We've got this, right, Dad?" he asked, looking up at Ben with wide eyes. Ben nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders. "We've got this, together." The town's farmers had become soldiers in a war they never asked for, and yet they were standing here, ready to fight for their lives. The armory, which had once held only tools for protection against wild animals, now held the weapons of rebellion. But they needed more than just weapons, they needed a plan. Ben turned to Jack, who had just finished gathering a rifle and a few extra rounds of ammunition. "We can't just rush in blindly," Ben said, his mind racing. "We need to hit them where it hurts. Take out their communication systems, their weapons, disable their ability to control those ships. If we do that, we might stand a chance." Jack looked over at him, his expression grim but determined. "We're not going to win this with firepower alone. We'll need to move fast, hit them where it counts, and then disappear before they know what happened." Ben nodded. "Then, we go for their command centers. We disrupt their coordination, get their forces scattered. If we can create chaos, it'll buy us time." As the group finished preparing, Ben stepped outside the armory. The smoke from burning buildings still hung thick in the air, and the faint crackle of alien weapons firing echoed in the distance. The first wave of invaders was already moving into the town. They had no time to waste. Ben's mind raced. There was no guarantee they would survive this. No guarantee that their small, ragtag group of farmers could defeat an alien army with advanced technology. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to let Earth go down without a fight. He turned to the group. "We're going to make them regret ever stepping foot on this land. They took our crops, but now we're going to take their empire." With rifles in hand and resolve in their hearts, the group of farmers made their way through the streets, their eyes locked on the alien ships above. Each step they took was one closer to the enemy. Each step brought them closer to making their stand. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to take back what was rightfully theirs. The ground shook beneath Ben's boots as he and the group of farmers moved silently through the smoke-filled streets of the town. The distant hum of the alien ships above seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Every moment felt like it might be their last, but Ben's mind remained focused. The first phase of the plan was clear: get to the communications tower and disable it. If they could sever the aliens' ability to coordinate their attacks, it would buy them precious time. Ben's hand rested on the rifle, slung over his shoulder, as he looked at the group moving alongside him. Ethan was right behind him, his grip tight on the shotgun. Jack and a few of the other farmers were flanking their left, eyes scanning every corner, every building. They had trained themselves to be cautious, to move swiftly and with purpose. Every step forward was another step into the unknown, but they had no choice but to keep moving. "We're close," Jack whispered, his voice a low rasp in the heavy silence. "The tower's just up ahead. We hit them fast, and we hit them hard." Ben nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We take it out, then we move to the next target, those ships. If we can get to their command center, we might have a shot at crippling their control." The street they were on was eerily quiet. The buildings around them stood in stark contrast to the chaos in the air. There were no signs of life, no civilians on the streets. Most of the population had either fled or were hiding in their homes, too terrified to make a stand. But Ben knew they couldn't rely on anyone else. It was up to them now. The town had become a battlefield, and it was their turf. This was Earth. This was their home. As they neared the communications tower, Ben signaled for the group to stop. They crouched behind a dilapidated truck, its rusted frame barely offering cover, but it was all they had. From this vantage point, Ben could see the alien forces patrolling the area. Tall, humanoid figures in heavy armor, their faces obscured by reflective visors, moved in methodical, almost robotic patterns. They carried energy weapons that crackled with deadly power. The farmers, by contrast, had only the crude weapons they'd scavenged from the armory. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. They had no backup, no air support. This was it. If they were going to make a difference, it had to be now. "On my mark," Ben said quietly, looking at the others. "We move fast. Take out the guards. Get to the tower. Don't stop until we're inside." The group nodded, their faces grim but resolute. The time for hesitation had passed. They were no longer just farmers. They were warriors. The sound of alien footsteps grew louder as one of the sentries walked past, unaware of the farmers hiding in the shadows. "Now," Ben hissed. The farmers moved as one. In a flash, Jack was up and sprinting toward the nearest guard. With a roar, he tackled the alien soldier to the ground, knocking the weapon from its hands. The alien grunted in surprise, but Jack was faster. With a swift motion, he retrieved the alien's weapon and fired, sending the soldier crumpling to the ground. The rest of the group surged forward, each farmer taking down one guard after another. The quiet precision of their actions was a stark contrast to the chaos of battle. For every alien soldier they took down, it was a small victory for Earth. A reminder that no matter how advanced their enemies were, humanity still had the heart to fight. Ben and Ethan reached the communications tower first. They moved quickly, crouching down to avoid the notice of any remaining guards. Ben pulled out a small charge from his bag, an old, homemade explosive crafted from the supplies they'd gathered. The plan was simple. Place the charge, set the timer, and get out of there before it blew. But even with a simple plan, the pressure of the moment weighed heavily on Ben. If they got this wrong, they wouldn't just fail. They would be wiped out. As he worked, Ben's hands shook, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He'd never imagined his life would come to this: a farmer, planting explosives, to take down an alien communication system. But here he was, surrounded by men and women who had once tended the land, now united in a fight for survival. "Almost there," Ben muttered as he placed the charge on the base of the tower. Ethan crouched beside him, scanning the area for any approaching threats. "Dad, they're coming. We've got to move." Ben finished setting the timer and stood, his heart racing. He turned to Ethan, his voice calm but firm. "Let's go." As they sprinted back to the cover of the truck, the ground beneath them suddenly trembled. The explosion rang out, sending a shockwave of sound through the air. The tower buckled, then crumbled to the ground in a fiery heap. The communication system was down. The aliens' ability to coordinate had been shattered, but as the dust settled and the roar of the blast faded, Ben's victory felt hollow. The alien forces would regroup. They would retaliate, and they would come for Earth harder than before. "Nice work," Ben Jack said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Ben wiped the sweat from his brow, nodding, but his eyes were focused on the sky. The alien ships hovered ominously above. They hadn't won yet. Not by a long shot. The fight had only just begun. "Let's move," Ben said. "Next target, the ships." The horizon above the small town was a battle-scarred wasteland. Alien ships hovered like vultures over a field of ruins, their weapons flashing in the distance, disintegrating what remained of human resistance. The once vibrant farmlands were now burned-out husks, and the lives of hundreds of people hung in the balance. The last line of defense for humanity, the farmers, wasn't just holding the line. They were ready to strike. Ben Carter and his ragtag group of farmers had made it this far, and now they were gearing up for the ultimate assault. Their plan was simple: take down the alien command center, disrupt their fleet, and make Earth uninhabitable for these invaders. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only option they had. The explosives had worked. The communications tower was in ruins, but that wasn't enough. The aliens would regroup, adapt, and strike harder than ever. They needed to go directly for the heart of the invasion, the alien flagship. The flagship had to go down, or Earth had no future. The town was all but abandoned. The surviving farmers and townspeople were hiding in underground bunkers, staying out of sight, while Ben, Ethan, Jack, and the others made their final preparations. They'd gathered every piece of weaponry they could find: dulled guns, alien techs salvaged from fallen ships, and homemade explosives. But no one was naive enough to think they could win with sheer firepower alone. They needed a plan, and time was running out. Ben had a gut feeling that this was the final stage of the war. The alien ships had been systematically targeting cities and towns, and the Earth's resources were being consumed faster than anyone could fathom. It had to end here. "We have one shot at this," Ben said, looking over the map that Jack had scrawled on a piece of old parchment. The map was crude, but it was enough to show them the weak points in the alien fleet's defense. If we hit them at their command center, the rest of the fleet will fall apart. Their technology is advanced, but they're not invincible. "We need to move fast," Jack added, gripping his rifle. "If we don't, the ships will turn this whole town into a crater." Ethan was already gathering supplies, his hands trembling but focused. "How are we even going to get inside the ship? They've got weapons that can vaporize us on sight." Ben slapped him on the back, a reassuring smile spreading across his face. "We're not just going to walk up and knock. We're going to make them regret ever touching this land. We're going to use their own tech against them." The plan was risky. A team would infiltrate the flagship's lower levels, plant explosives at critical junctions, and sabotage their navigation systems. Meanwhile, Ben and Ethan would lead a group to create a diversion, drawing the alien soldiers away from their target. "We don't have time to wait for perfect. We strike now," Ben said, his eyes narrowing as he looked at his son. "Stay close, Ethan. We're in this together." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the mission settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for Earth. The group, now fully armed and prepared for what might be their last stand, made their way toward the outskirts of town, where the alien flagship loomed like a dark god in the sky. The ship was far larger than anything humanity had ever seen, its dark metallic surface glinting under the firestorm of battle. Ben and Jack's team moved first, slipping into position behind a cluster of burning debris to hide their approach. The alien soldiers, nearly 10 feet tall, patrolled the perimeter, their glowing eyes scanning the area. Armed with weapons that crackled with deadly energy, they were formidable adversaries. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. They had no choice now. They had to get inside the flagship, no matter the cost. "The door's just ahead," Jack whispered. "We've got one shot, no turning back." Ben didn't hesitate. "Move." In seconds, they were at the door. Jack worked the alien technology, using a mixture of brute force and luck to hack into the ship's security system. A low hum echoed through the walls, and the door slid open, revealing a hallway inside. Ethan swallowed hard. "Here goes nothing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They moved inside, weapons ready, navigating the dark, metallic halls of the alien ship. The air was thick with tension, and every footstep echoed in the silence. Ben's heart raced as he and Ethan moved forward, while Jack and the others covered the rear. Their mission was clear: get to the central core, plant the explosives, and escape before the ship fell. As they advanced deeper into the heart of the flagship, they encountered little resistance either. The aliens were caught off guard, or their main forces were still distracted by the diversion. But as they reached the core's control room, everything changed. The aliens were waiting for them. The room was filled with sleek, intimidating figures in battle armor, their weapons trained on the team. Ben's instincts kicked in, and he pulled Ethan behind him, aiming his rifle. "Get back," he shouted. A sharp, cold voice echoed from across the room. "You should not have come here, human," the alien commander said, stepping forward. It was taller than the others, its face a mask of shimmering metal. "You are nothing but ants before us." "Not today," Ben spat. "You came for our crops, for our world. Now we're taking it back." The battle that followed was chaos. Blasts of energy filled the air, and the floor shook as explosions rang out. Ben ducked behind a console, narrowly avoiding a blast that singed the wall beside him. Ethan, despite his fear, fought valiantly beside him, his shotgun taking down 2 of the alien soldiers. Jack and the others were not far behind, picking off alien soldiers one by one, but they had limited time. The explosives they planted had only minutes before the countdown began. "We need to plant the last charge," Jack yelled, his voice strained. "Ben, cover us." Ben fired, taking down an alien that was closing in on their position. He felt his body tremble, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. He couldn't fail now. The countdown ticked down. Seconds felt like hours. And then, with a loud explosion, the core detonated. The ship trembled. The walls cracked, and sparks flew from the ruptured systems. Ben grabbed Ethan, pulling him toward the escape pod as the ship's alarm blared. The ship was breaking apart. "We've got to go, now," Ben yelled. They raced toward the escape pod, their hearts pounding in their chests. The entire flagship was coming down, and they had no time to spare. They barely made it. As the pod ejected into the sky, Ben watched the flagship behind them explode in a burst of fire and energy. The alien fleet was in disarray, and the ground shook beneath them as the final remnants of the invaders' flagship crashed into the earth. The fight wasn't over. The alien fleet was still out there, but Earth had a chance. The rebellion had given humanity something they hadn't had in years: hope. Ben, Carter, and the farmers who had stood alongside him were the beginning of the resistance. The war was not over, but Earth had proven one thing: it could fight back, and it would.